Hello everyone and welcome to this, our first installment of the North Carolina's Candid Critters Catching Carnivores webinar series, where we're presenting to you our first topic on coyotes, one of our favorite species of all time. And with us, of course, are your hosts from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and North Carolina State University. I'm Ariel Parsons.
And I'm Roland Kays.
And we're here to present to you some of the results and some of our findings on coyotes from the North Carolina's Candid Critters camera trapping project, where we have volunteers running cameras from all across the state, giving us data that we can then use to find cool stuff and answer scientific questions about this species.
Right, so some of you out there have already run cameras with us, and so you'll be seeing some of the pictures that you guys have gotten, and some of the data, right? We pull in all the data together, and we crunch the numbers, and we see what we find, and so we're going to be presenting some of those really fresh results. And some of you out there from North Carolina may not have run cameras yet, but we hope you'll join us in the future because we always need more data. We're always refining and using this information to learn more about the Candid critters in our state. So today we're going to start off with coyotes, and we're going to start with a couple of our favorite pictures that we've gotten from, that you guys have gotten from coyotes across the state. And I like this one from Gates County. He's kind of tucked out from behind the tree. He looks like he's suddenly noticed maybe there's a piece of plastic camera sitting there looking at the camera, and he's kind of big.
He's really big. I mean, this is what I think of when I think of a coyote. Like kind of that grayish brown coat, you know, pretty robust, like almost wolf-like. In appearance, and the thing that I love about this picture is how much he blends in, how much the coloration. We don't usually, I mean, really they're more of a nocturnal species, but you know, when they come out during the day, it's pretty advantageous to blend in to the background, and I think that's in part, you know, why we don't see coyotes very often. They're out at night.
Coyotes are, right, they're hard to see. I've only seen with my own eyes like 2 coyotes in North Carolina. So this guy, you can see it's kind of it looks like a March photograph, and he's a little bit, he's got his big winter coat on. He looks kind of big, he's kind of camouflaged. But we get some really diverse set of coyotes in the pictures. And so here's a picture. This looks like a blonde, like a strawberry blonde coyote.
This to me looks like a golden retriever. And I mean, we know that it's a coyote, but they're really diverse. We don't always see that typical coloration. And if we look at the next photo, this, I mean, this is the only time this is the only time I've ever seen this kind of coloration, which I think we call brindle. And it, you know, reminds me more of something more appropriate to like a mastiff or a boxer or something like that, not so much a coyote.
We're going to come back to, in a second, to why this coyote might look like
that's what we're going to be talking about in part today. Some of this variation, some of the cool things about coyotes, and the things that we're finding.
Cool. So the amazing thing about coyotes in North Carolina, some people don't realize, they didn't used to be here.
Right.
They are a new immigrant. You might call them an invasive species, but they've colonized on their own. And so on this side, we're looking at the original range of coyotes. They're originally in the western United States, basically open country, deserts, prairie, grasslands, and then around 1900, right around 1900, 1910, 1920, they started moving. They moved north, and now you can see they're in pretty much all of Alaska. They moved east, so they moved into North Carolina, all the eastern deciduous forest, they moved into that. And they also moved south into the rainforest. So while originally they were really this open country animal, now they're still in the open country, but now you can see they're pretty much have covered almost the entire continent, which is really interesting. And so they're definitely a new species in North Carolina, first hitting in about the 1990s in different parts of the state.
So really recent arrival.
Really, yeah, I mean, for old people like you and me, pretty recent, right? So we have on our website at candidcritters.org, you can see a picture of a map of really up-to-date data from today of where our camera traps have got coyotes and relatively how common they are. And so you can see pretty much they're everywhere, right? They are in every single county across the state.
East to west, north to south.
North to south. There's a couple gray counties. That means we don't have data yet, so we really need help from people you know, if you live there, please go run camera traps. And if you don't live there, grab a camera trap locally and bring it over and try it out. We need help filling in some of these gaps. We know there's coyotes there, but we don't know how many there are relative to the other place. Meanwhile, you can look across the state and see some of these dark green areas where we have, you know, relatively higher picture rate. So when our cameras are out, they get more pictures. And over on the left, over on the side here, you can see how many pictures we're getting in these areas. And the dark green areas are 0.25 coyotes per day. So that's basically a coyote every 4 days is walking in front of the camera traps. And that's pretty interesting that we're seeing, some really pretty high abundances over there on the coast, and then sort of scattered in some other areas. So one of the questions we are really interested in is what's determining why there's more coyotes in some places than others?
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, food's got to play a role.
Yeah.
And I presume some sort of habitat kind of, and humans.
And humans. These are the things that we're looking at. Food, which is prey especially, and habitat types, open fields, forests, etc. And so this brings up the question of how are eastern coyotes living in North Carolina and other places different than western coyotes?
Well, I mean, so we previously, as you explained, we previously thought that coyotes really needed open habitats.
That's the only place we found them.
Right, that's where they spent all of their time and really require. But what we're finding in the east is actually these coyotes are using the forest just as much, if not more, than they're using these open habitats, which is kind of a distinction that we find between what we call the western coyotes and the eastern coyotes, same species, but definitely kind of different habitat preferences.
And we have some data from the Candid Project on this exactly. We've looked at the camera trap sites that are in sites that are forested and in sites that are open. And
we're finding, I mean, more or less equal use, but we see a little bit of a bump in the forest. I mean, they're not avoiding it.
So
they're almost preferring it.
The coyotes are everywhere, right?
Yeah.
They've gone from a species that was a prairie, desert, open land species to a species that can live everywhere.
And I mean, it looks like these, again, are the same species, but they've got some other differences too, besides just habitat preferences, right?
Right. So we're finding, if you compare east to west, okay, this is where they originally lived in the west, and where they are in the east, there's some obvious differences in size. The eastern coyotes are, on average, about 10 pounds heavier. And sometimes we've even seen animals up to 50 pounds. We sort of say, on average, 35 to 45 pounds. We have seen some animals. I know I've heard rumors of 60, 70, 80, 90, 100-pound coyotes.
Really big to me.
Yeah, those I'm not sure what those are,
Looks
or
like
if
a
they were
wolf size.
Well, I'm not sure they were actually measured with a scale. It was someone who said, "Oh, that's a 100-pound coyote." But when we actually can weigh them on a scale, the maximum that I've personally seen is 51 or 52 pounds. Generally, 35 to 45 pounds is what we find. A 45-pound animal is pretty big, but that's much bigger than the West. And the other interesting thing that we find that's different, east to west, is that we are seeing these more colorful coyotes in the east a lot more. So we get like a black animal like we see here from Cleveland County, whereas you compare from Montana or other places in the West, you get this generic, I sort of call it the wild type coyote, right? Yeah. It's kind of sandy colored, it blends in really well, and we showed you some pictures at the beginning of these wacky looking coyotes. That shows up in the east a lot more than the west. And so that brings up some questions. Why are eastern coyotes bigger and more funny colored than the west? And it seems to have something to do with this, right? The idea is that actually eastern coyotes have genes from other species mixed in. So they aren't 100% coyote. They've got some wolf genes mixed in. And wolves and coyotes are generally enemies. Right. Wolves kill coyotes. But there's some situations that we think happened probably 100 years ago or so when wolves were really rare, probably in the Great Lakes area. And there was some time when a female wolf probably couldn't find anyone to breed with. Right. And there were a bunch of coyotes running around. And so she basically took the next best thing that she could get. And that resulted in this hybrid that then crossed back with coyotes. So it had a little bit of wolf and a lot of coyotes. And those are the animals that moved east. Mm-hmm. And as they moved east, there was some coyote that was the first one to move into whatever area. Maybe the first one to move into New York State, first one to move into North Carolina State, the first one to move into maybe Wake County. And there would have been no other coyotes around, right? By definition, as an animal's moving on, then they're going to have trouble mating. But there would have been some dogs running around. And so this was a second type of hybridization that happened. And they hybridized with dogs, but then the rest of the coyotes caught up. And they crossed back with the coyotes. So what we have today across the East Coast is this, we call it a hybrid swarm, which sounds scary, but it just means that the coyote has this mixture of genes, and all the tests have shown that it's mostly coyote. It's like 85, 90, 95% coyote, and the rest is a mixture combination of dog and wolf genes. And this is what has helped the coyote to kind of become bigger.
Right.
and
The
to
wolf
become
gene.
right from the
Wolf
wolf,
gene.
and to become more colorful from the dog gene. So it seems like if you have the sort of right combinations of dog genes, you're going to get something that's black or that's looks like a German Shepherd, or who
We've
knows
had those.
what could happen.
We didn't show any pictures, but we've had those. And yeah, so that explains the one that looked like the brindle-colored one and the one that looked like the golden retriever.
It's probably some
had
happen
some
mix,
golden
right?
retriever.
So on average, they're 80 to 95% coyote with a mixture of these other genes mixed in. And today, they're not hybridizing with dogs anymore, right? So we have dogs and coyotes living
they
together.
don't need to, right?
They don't need to because there's so many coyotes around.
Coyotes now. Yeah.
And so they're actually more likely to fight with dogs than they are to breed with dogs. And we don't see any, what we would call an F1 hybrid, any first generation hybrids of dogs and coyotes. So what do we have today is we have this animal that is mostly coyote with a little bit of dog and a little bit of wolf mixed in. And so what are they? What are they doing?
Well, one big part of kind of their social structure is the pack. But unlike wolves, we think of wolves as being those like quintessential pack animals that hunt together, they take out big game. Coyotes don't actually tend to hunt in packs. And we see that when we see our camera data. We only very rarely get, this is 4 coyotes in this picture. It's relatively rare for us to see that. It's usually just 1 or 2, together. And we know that they don't necessarily hunt together in the pack, but they may help each other out in terms of breeding, like taking care of the pups, right? But there's a reason that they don't necessarily hunt together in packs. And you think of the wolves, of course, they kind of need the pack to take down those big game.
Right, so wolves hunt mostly large prey. They hunt elk. Sometimes they even hunt bison. Of course, they hunt deer really well.
You need other friends to help you out with that.
Right.
But these guys tend to eat mostly, we call this other stuff, but that's really, we're talking fruit, insects, maybe small mammals, not things that you necessarily have to hunt, rabbits, like in a pack. And you're one coyote, you could take care of that, and you don't really want to share it with anyone else.
Because if you say you jump on a snake and you got to share it with 5 other pack mates, that's barely a snack.
That's not worth it. That's totally not worth it. So that makes sense. Now they do have about a third of their diet is deer.
Right, and so coyotes can definitely kill adult deer. We know that it happens. It's probably mostly the sick deer or the ones that have been injured from a roadkill. They're definitely scavenging on roadkill deer. And the amount of deer in their diet varies a lot. In fact, the studies in North Carolina in specific have found quite a lot of fruit and insects in their diet. They really like persimmon.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried persimmon?
I do too. I like persimmon.
Oh, it's so
too.
tart. I can't eat it, but
like
they love persimmon. They eat a lot of persimmon and insects. Deer in North Carolina isn't actually important, but in some places, well, it's important, but it's not like the biggest part.
The bulk of their
There's
diet,
some other places where they eat a lot of deer. So we know they can hunt deer individually. They don't seem to really be packing up, but we know that they will hunt fawns, of course. Fawns are super vulnerable, these baby deer, and whatever can find a fawn is going to hunt them.
It's going to eat it. Yeah.
And so coyotes are no different. And one of the things that we wanted to look at is this relationship between coyotes and fawns.
And we're really just in the beginning stages of this, right? I mean, we would love to get more data from all around the state, and that's where our volunteers come in.
Right. But we do have some data from camera traps that show, and so this is showing how many fawns did we see in terms of pictures per day of fawns, and it's sites that didn't have coyotes and sites that did have coyotes. And you can see, well, where coyotes are present, there was a lot more fawns.
So what does that mean, do you think?
Well, it means probably, for one thing, that coyotes are going to the places where there's lots of fawns. And that's good coyote hunting ground, which isn't too surprising. But, one of the things that we are interested in is whether coyotes are a big limitation on fawns. And if they were, a prediction would be that where there are lots of coyotes, there would be very few fawns.
Right, so we would expect this to be
much lower. And so we didn't find that. So it doesn't totally disprove it, but it doesn't support the hypothesis that coyotes are a big impact on fawns. No doubt they're somewhat of an impact, and if I was a fawn, I certainly wouldn't want to see a coyote. But on average, it seems like they're not sort of totally reducing the fawns in this regard.
So, okay, they eat fawns. They eat insects, not so much friends with those. What about these other predators? This is another area that we're really interested in to see how are coyotes influencing or affecting bobcats and gray fox, which are kind of the 2 other predators that have quite a lot of diet overlap with coyotes and have been shown in other places in the United States to actually interact really negatively
Right, and so there's examples of coyotes killing foxes, chasing foxes, going into fox dens and trying to kill their puppies. They really don't like the foxes. Bobcats and coyotes is a little bit more of a standoff, right? They're sort of the same body size, and I think they just kind of know they probably don't really want to fight with each other. But there would be some potential for one to be out-competing the other. And so one of the things that these camera trap data allow us to do is to see, do we find these species avoiding each other spatially?
Yeah, so are they using the same area? And what we found so far is they are. That we don't see any evidence of avoidance spatially. But that doesn't mean that they don't avoid each other temporally, meaning they use the same area but at different times.
So you're saying that if we have a camera trap out that detects one of these species, it's more likely to detect another one of the species than not.
Exactly.
Wow, that's cool. But so interesting. So spatially, they're using the same areas. I guess we need to dive into the temporal data a little bit more and see.
I'll be working on that next week.
Next week, get to work. Yeah. Right. So there's a possibility that maybe a coyote walks by and the fox is like, oh, I'm going to avoid this area for a while. Or maybe the fox knows the coyote always comes by right after sunset, and so it avoids that time and then comes by later.
Exactly.
So these are the kind of things, because these camera traps record the GPS location and record the time of day, we can look at some of these types of questions. So one of the big questions about coyotes in North Carolina and in every state, especially in the east, is how many are there, and are they increasing or decreasing?
Right.
And this is a really interesting graph of the number of coyotes trapped by fur trappers and reported by fur trappers. And this is from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And you can see, very few, because we had no coyotes for a long time. And then, eventually they started trapping them. And it's been growing exponentially.
That's amazing.
Like crazy, right? And so this isn't a perfect measure of population size, but it suggests that the coyote population size has been growing. And we know it's been growing because it started at 0 and now it's many. And so, but what's interesting about this graph is it hasn't leveled off yet, right? And so by 2015, it was still growing. And so the question as to, how many coyotes are we going to have? Well, chances are we're going to have more,
right?
Because they're still growing. And the other very interesting thing about this is if you look at the same graph for South Carolina, it looks almost identical.
Wow.
Virginia, almost identical. So all across the East Coast, coyotes are still expanding and haven't yet leveled off. So it seems like in the future, we're probably going to have more coyotes. And whether they start to have more of an impact on deer or on fawns or on foxes is something that we're going to have to see once we get into the future with more coyotes. And so there's a concern. Some people don't like coyotes. They eat their goats, right? They could potentially be a threat. Some deer hunters don't like having coyotes around, and so they want to reduce the number of coyotes. They want to control the coyotes by shooting them, trapping them, and hunting them, and that makes sense. If you want to have fewer coyotes, let's kill them.
Kill them, yeah.
But the truth is, so far, that doesn't work. And there's two reasons. One is because of this graph I showed you where there's strong population growth. These animals are increasing all over the place. And the other point comes from, this is a map, and it shows, there was a study by NC State that GPS collared a whole bunch of coyotes around Fort Bragg here. And you can see one animal dispersed all the way up north of Richmond, and the other animal dispersed all the way across South Carolina, almost into Georgia. And the point of this is that these coyotes are really, really mobile. So the teenagers, basically, are out there looking for a new home, and these two factors combined mean that it's really hard, if not impossible, to really limit the local population.
Yeah, and in fact, we have some data sets from our camera trapping that show that we actually have a higher relative abundance of coyotes in areas that are hunted. So what is going on there? Is that a fact?
Well, again, we're getting into the hypothesis realm a little bit of what we think might be happening. We don't really know. Yeah. But so we know coyotes form these packs. They have these territories. And if a teenager wants to go into that area, he's going to be kept out by the alphas. Right. And if those alphas are killed by hunters or trappers, they create basically social chaos. And so you remove one animal, basically 4 or 5 animals try to come in, and eventually that will level off, and one animal will establish, and they'll establish a new pack. But if you keep having this removal of animals, the idea is, and again, this is unproven, this is an idea, is that you constantly have all these teenagers coming into this area trying to establish themselves. So that's one idea and this is why, and the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission also recognizes that, you're probably not going to be able to really limit the population locally by trapping, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't trap.
Right. There are advantages to actually trapping, and the big one is that it keeps the animals from developing its boldness and approaching near. So this is a picture of coyotes. This is what we don't want, right outside a house. And if we don't have any sort of checks on that sort of behavior, then it's going to proliferate.
Right. So here we have coyotes coming into a house, coming into a neighborhood, looking for food near a house. And this is what we really don't want, because if they see a cat, that's food. If they see a small dog, that's food. If they see a small kid, it could potentially happen. It has happened, right? Yeah. In North Carolina, I think there's maybe one example recently of a kid who got attacked. So we want to keep coyotes shy, and hunting and trapping is definitely one way that we can do that. You want to?
Yeah. So, as we saw with that picture, these coyotes had come into, obviously, a developed area. And so it does happen. But they're nowhere near as common in these developed areas as we see in the forest and the open areas. But it definitely does happen.
Right, and these animals aren't necessarily bold, right? So there's a lot of forest in our developed areas.
Yeah, and that's where they're getting around. That's how they're getting around.
This is where we're finding, right? So we're finding cameras that you folks set in your backyard, very few coyotes. Yeah. Cameras that you set in the woods back behind your house, that's where we're finding their coyotes. And so they're integrating themselves into the natural area. And so far in North Carolina, they're still pretty shy of people.
Yeah, but we do see, if you go to the next picture, we do see them all over some of these suburban areas. They occur, as many of you can attest to, but I often get, so this is the triangle area. The gray circles are where we didn't detect any coyotes, but the colored circles are where we did. So you can see they're everywhere.
All along the greenway, a lot of these are greenway sites. We got coyotes, really mixed in, within the belt line and outside the belt line, all over the place, very deep in there. We are getting some coyotes. Now, on average, fewer coyotes in here than out in the surrounding area, but the coyotes have, as their population increases, the young animals are like, well, where can I have a breeding territory? Yep. How about this little patch of woods in the suburban neighborhood? Exactly. No other coyotes are there, and look, there's a bunch of squirrels and rabbits.
And our volunteers are often so surprised when they live in a suburban area. They're like, I had never seen signs of coyotes, never seen a coyote, and boom, they get one on their camera. But they're not really hanging out in yards.
We're not seeing too much of that.
They're not doing that. Yeah.
Well, so that's the end, right? We got the coyote end here of our presentation. But we'd love to take questions from y'all. If you have questions, you can type them into the comments field, and we'll answer the questions about coyotes. And we'll also take this opportunity to mention that this is the first of our series of webinars on carnivores, and so.
Our next one is May 16th, and we're going to be talking about bears.
Right, but it's not you and me.
It's not me and you. It's our hosts, Haley Boone and Dr. Stephanie Shuttler from North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in NC State. Great. Yeah.
So if you have questions about coyotes, feel free to type them into Facebook or YouTube, and we'll answer the questions here in a second as they come in. So the first question here is, do coyotes eat garbage? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I would guess yes.
Well, it kind of depends on where the garbage is, right? So coyotes are not as good as raccoons, the trash pandas, your favorites, the ones we've got featured on our shirts here.
We do have our shirts.
So coyotes are not like opening up garbage cans and going into garbage to go. They're not. They don't have the opposable hands that raccoons have. And so what we find is that if there's food laying around, they will eat human food, right? A McDonald's cheeseburger, they're going to eat it. Right. And actually, it's more often actually people feeding them on purpose than them actually raiding garbage. So they're not nearly the garbage can raiders of some of the other species, but they will eat food. They're more likely to eat. You know what a really big issue is? Sometimes in some of the agriculture areas, if there's always some cows and some goats and whatever that die, and they'll pile those animals up in a pit.
Oh, right.
And
perfect
guess what?
For coyotes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So they really do scavenge quite a bit.
Yeah.
Like rather than necessarily being kind of more like a wolf, like a hunter of fresh.
Well, game. And it's interesting because coyotes are some of the. I think they're the smartest, and I might be exaggerating a little
Trash
bit, but
panda.
The trash panda is a pretty smart one. But coyotes have a really, really strong sense of smell.
Yeah.
And so they're really hard to trap because they will see, they can smell sort of where you are, and they'll avoid your where you put your traps really well. And so they're hard to trap. And sometimes I think when they see a dead carcass, they're just suspicious.
Right.
Of, is this really
They
for
are
me?
smart. Yeah.
Or does someone have traps around it? So, the interesting thing about coyotes is coyotes are mesopredators. Mm-hmm. And this means that they need to look out for prey that they can hunt,
right.
But they also need to look out for predators that are going after them. And so they're kind of in the middle. And that puts them actually in a very interesting situation where they need to be able to find prey while still looking out for predators, which I think makes them really adaptable for avoiding humans.
And we talked about, how they interact with bobcats and gray foxes. Do they have any predators other than humans in
That's
North
a good
Carolina?
question. So in North Carolina, in the east, there is the red wolf. And so the red wolf will definitely harass and kill coyotes.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes they breed with coyotes because they're pretty close in body size.
Right.
But generally, other than that small area in the peninsula where the red wolves are, there's basically nothing, other than humans, no animals that the coyotes have to worry about. So in other parts of the world, they have to worry about wolves,
right.
full-size wolves, gray wolves, cougars, also known as mountain lions, and jaguars.
Oh.
And so in the south.
Right.
And so those are the animals, those are the predators that would definitely cause problems for coyotes. Okay, well, we should take another question.
Yeah, well, let's see. We've got a question here. How many puppies do they have?
That's a good question. So coyotes generally, on average, they're going to have sort of 2, 4, 5, 6 pups. But there are records of them having. I know Stan Garrett in Chicago has found 12 puppies in one litter.
That's like a golden retriever.
How do you feed them all, right? How do you have the equipment to feed them all? And so, and that's a sign that they've got plenty of food, right? So they can sort of, as they're pregnant and as they're getting pregnant, they can sort of regulate how many pups they have. I mean, they don't do it on purpose, right? But
right.
If they've got tons of food, they're going to have more puppies, and that shows that in these urban areas of Chicago, they actually have quite a lot of problems. All right, so we got another question here. What is the craziest looking coyote that you've ever seen?
Uh-oh. What is the craziest looking coyote we've ever seen?
Well, so mine.
That you've ever seen? You've probably seen some crazy ones.
I've seen. I'll give you 2 answers. One is we got a picture of a camera trap from North Carolina of a coyote that was totally normal looking, except his tail tip was black and then white. And it had this black-white, it was like just like the last couple inches of its tail tip was black and white. And I don't know where that comes from because, I don't know, is that a dog trait?
I mean, it must be certainly there are dogs.
But you know dogs who have just a little black and white tail tip?
Sure. Well, I mean, yeah, it happens.
I don't know. That one kind of blew my mind because I'd never seen anything like that in a coyote, and I don't feel like maybe someone can respond and tell us what kind of dog breed has a tail tip that's like 1 inch black and 1 inch white right on the tip. The other one was one that I found. I went when I was collecting tissue samples and specimens to study the genetics of coyotes. We went to one of these coyote tournaments, which is where they basically try to kill as many coyotes as they can. And it's a tournament, so whoever brings in the most coyotes with the heaviest coyote wins. And the number 2 coyote that took second place, this is in Mosquito Creek, Pennsylvania, they had hundreds, I think 170 coyotes, so they killed a lot of coyotes across the state. It was a little bit gruesome, but the number 2 coyote weighed 48 pounds and was super shaggy. Like Benji the dog shaggy. You know, like Benji the dog has this long fur.
Yeah.
And it was a 48-pound Benji coyote. So that was the other one. And we actually tested that one working with Bridget Von Holt at Princeton University. And it had a gene for shaggy hair that they know about from dogs. And it's the only time she's ever seen that in anything other than a dog.
Interesting.
And so this was some of the evidence that we used to realize that that coyotes and dogs must be interbreeding.
Well, here's another question related to that, actually. Do coyotes have double coats?
Double coats?
Yeah.
What's a double coat?
Oh, it's a dog thing.
Okay, so I don't know about this
So maybe
one.
not. It's like some breeds of dogs, especially the northern breeds, you have to brush out, like they have an undercoat and then an overcoat for the winter.
Okay. Well, so coyotes definitely have longer, fluffier coats during the winter, and thinner coats during the summer. I don't know. This is a new trait for me.
So you'd have to go out and brush them.
We're going to have to go on a coyote
maybe
brushing
spring.
expedition
Yeah,
and brush
all
them
right.
all. And we're definitely going to have to go down to Panama because we've been running camera traps in Panama and getting pictures of coyotes in Panama, and they have really, really, really thin coats. They're never shaggy.
Which makes sense because it's so warm down there.
It's
right?
so warm, right? But there must be some genetic selection, right? There must have been some trait for thinner hair, and that must have helped them have some shorter hair that's kind of evolved over the time. So we've got a question here from Talicia about distinctive markings with Siberian Huskies and Alaskan Malamutes, and have we seen evidence of breeding with domestic dogs? So we definitely see, yes, coyotes have definitely bred with dogs.
Definitely.
I can't say whether they bred with your Malamute or anyone's husky or whatever. I mean, so huskies are kind of the most coyote-looking breed.
Or Malamute, yeah.
Right, and they're definitely coyote size. And so we do think that there's probably some body size issue going on. If you're going to mate across species, you're much more likely to mate with something that's kind of your size.
Right, not so much a Chihuahua. I mean, we've never seen, like a Chihuahua.
Oh my God, could you imagine a coyote Chihuahua hybrid?
That would not be.
That would be difficult.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Chihuahua would survive, honestly. But huskies,
But
Malamutes.
certainly a husky. I mean, that's definitely that's basically coyote. Maybe a little bigger.
Yeah.
than
So
coyote.
I've definitely seen a very German Shepherd-looking coloration where they have this sort of the sideline and they're black on the back
black and tan.
and tan on the side. And I guess I don't know what a husky would really look like. We've seen some that kind of look similar.
Maybe a little more black and white instead of gray.
But the other
like a more
interesting
vibrant
question
black,
is
white.
what dogs are out there running around
Right.
and that the coyotes could actually hybridize
Right, because they're most likely, I would think, not coming into your backyard to your. I mean, maybe in a rural area.
Well, they are, but
Yeah.
but what are you have to think on both sides. What are the dogs that are out there running around the woods that might be interested in a coyote that the coyote might be interested in? So maybe the Malamutes and the purebred, the purebreds are probably, I guess.
I don't know.
My point is,
Malamutes, they like to run.
oh, do they?
Oh yeah. Oh, the huskies too.
Well, they do, but maybe they're not out there running free
Right.
as much as kind of the more mutts,
Hopefully.
and then you kind of never know what we've got.
So we've got another question from Bonnie. Have you ever seen any domesticated coyotes? That's a good question.
Doesn't work very well.
Doesn't work.
No, and there's this famous experiment in Russia where they've taken red foxes, and domesticated them over many, many generations. No one's tried that with coyotes.
Yeah.
But I do know a number of people who have tried to just take a coyote in and make it a pet, and that doesn't work. They are wild animals, and they want to run free, and they're quite likely to bite you and nip you. And I've seen them be trained on kind of one person, right, where the one person can walk them on the leash and can pet them
Almost
a little bit.
like an alpha member of the pack sort of thing.
Maybe something like that, yeah, where they'll have kind of respect, but they're super suspicious about any other animals, and so it doesn't work very well in that regard.
Yeah, and they are, a completely separate species from dogs, which we have co-evolved with for thousands of years.
Right. So
domesticated.
dogs are a wolf offshoot, right? Dogs and wolves are each other's closest relatives, and coyotes are much more distantly related from that. We have another question there. We're trying to get another question here. So let's see. We've got a question here about coyotes and deer, and are coyotes limiting deer populations through their hunting? And this is a big question because we know coyotes are eating deer,
Right.
and we know they're killing fawns, and we know they can sometimes kill adults. And so you would think that they probably have a potential to limit the populations of deer. But actually, what we find is that there's kind of this big experiment, right? Where basically across the East Coast, we had lots of deer, coyotes moved in, and so if coyotes were having a big impact on the deer, we'd expect the deer population to crash.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen
that, have we?
right? No, nowhere. So
On the contrary, perhaps.
on the large scale, deer populations are going up, and coyote populations are going up, and so there hasn't been a very big impact. So what we think is that coyotes are basically just living off the surplus, right? There's so many deer out there that the coyotes can, they can hunt their rabbits, they can hunt their mice, they can eat the fruit, you can eat the insects, and there's a deer that was hit by a car. Well, let's go take advantage of that for a week or something.
And it's possible maybe that in local pockets where you have a really high coyote population, that there could be local impacts, but it's, kind of on the grand scheme of things, we aren't seeing any compelling evidence yet.
Right, so it could be happening on a small scale. And the other thing to consider is that we can do these models, right, where we program and see what's the effect of coyotes eating fawns versus eating adults of different ages. And, because every year females are having, multiple fawns every year, killing a fawn has sort of less of an effect on the overall population size than killing an adult. And so we definitely know that coyotes kill a lot of fawns, but there's so many fawns out there that it's in general less effective than if they were actually killing adults during the winter, for example.
Well, it looks like we have another one from Talisha. Is the general public crossbreeding coyotes on purpose?
Oh, I hope not.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I imagine that would be breaking some laws. I'm not totally sure. So there,
what would the purpose be? I guess
to sell them, maybe. I don't know. I mean, you can buy some wolf dogs on the internet in some states. It's illegal in many states. It's generally not advisable because wolf dogs tend to be
have the same problem as domesticated.
Yeah, only they're bigger, and so that generally doesn't work. Honestly, I'm not up to date on what's for sale in the pet industry for these kinds of things, but
I've certainly never heard of coyotes.
I mean, coyotes are so hard to keep in captivity that if you're not like a zoo, it's going to be pretty hard. You can't just keep them in your bedroom. That doesn't work. And so I've never actually heard of anyone purposely crossbreeding coyotes. So
and I wonder really how well they would do in kind of a more domestic environment. They seem so skittish, and shy. That I think that they would have a constant anxiety.
Yeah, anxiety, big anxiety. Well, we should probably wrap it up pretty soon. So maybe one last question: how do coyotes and raccoons get along?
Wow, I don't know the answer to that.
You don't know the answer to that question?
Has anyone?
So if you don't know, Ariel is a big raccoon fan,
and Roland is a big coyote fan.
So I have to say that actually they don't really interact that much.
Right, they kind of seem to avoid.
They don't. I think coyotes know that raccoons
would beat them up.
Seriously,
honestly, I truly believe in a tangle between a coyote and a raccoon that the raccoon would win.
Not totally win. I think the coyote would win, but the coyote would get pretty scratched up, and it wouldn't be worth the meal.
They're too timid. See, the raccoons are just they're really just very fierce, and coyotes they're actually pretty,
So actually, studies people study coyote diet, and they very rarely find raccoon in the diet very often of coyotes. And there's been some work that have done some experiments where they put out coyote scat and see if raccoons avoid the coyote scat. They don't.
No, raccoons don't avoid anything.
If there's food there, they're gonna go right for it. And so it seems like coyotes and raccoons have kind of had this standoff where the coyote knows, if I was dying of starvation, maybe worth it, but likely I'm gonna
be way
more trouble than it's worth. And so coyotes and raccoons tend to stick together. So thanks a lot for all your questions and for joining us today. We're going to wrap this one up, but remember, we're going to be back on May 16th, with some information about bears, and this will be some general information, but also some very specific stuff about what we've been finding from the camera traps.
Lots of bears.
Run in North Carolina. Lots of bears, but not everywhere.
Not
and that's
everywhere.
Pretty interesting.
That's right.
And if you're in North Carolina and you want to join our project, remember you can go to ncandidcritters.org and sign up to run a camera trap, this little training program. Then you can check out a camera trap. We've got them spread out across libraries all around the state, so you can check a camera trap out of a library.
Exactly.
Join us, help us learn more about bears, coyotes, carnivores,
and
deer,
every
squirrels.
mammal that we have, even turkeys, which aren't a mammal.
Even our favorite bird, the turkey. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all on May 16th.